Nowadays, we can't afford the risk anymore of not learning and not constantly wanting to evolve and be better because the world is moving quickly. And what a great way to be able to support that. Go out and say hello. It's as simple as that. Introduce yourself. Even if you've been there for years, I guarantee there's a bunch of people that don't know you. And maybe they don't quite understand what you do, or they just have this perception. You don't have to be the person that builds all the content. Go for that social learning approach. Leverage the subject matter experts. I always believe that our role is actually to be guardians of learning and to put the framework around it and to kind of culminate and curate all that knowledge to create that experience by leveraging different people, by leveraging technology, etc., to help bring that to life.
How we learn now.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by HowNow, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use HowNow to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, Forsaven, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.
Penny, we've had many of these conversations off record, but this is the first time I've managed to get you on record.
No,
I'm
exciting.
super excited.
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here. This is great.
Thanks for coming on the show. I've always been fascinated by the fact that you've kind of managed two worlds. Like, I don't know many people who've owned L&D as well as enablement. And I've always said to you, I'm quite fascinated by that. And also, you have a very unique perspective as a result of owning both of those things. But how did you land in that situation? Like, what came first? L&D and enablement? Tell me the story.
So it actually started with L&D, and I actually fell into L&D, probably like a lot of people. And I was in a call center. I was really good at selling, and yes, I sold my soul for 250 calls a day. But because I was quite good at it, I actually moved into kind of coaching of people, and that's how I ended up in L&D. And it was very traditional L&D, so it was a lot of typical kind of training stuff, inductions, things like that. And then as I started to move into that training space, I then moved into training as a service. So then I was out with customers and even doing some pre-sales, so actually going out and demoing software, for example. And that's how I started to dip my toe into that world of enablement. Bearing in mind, just to show my age, enablement wasn't a term then, it didn't exist. And it's kind of how I ended up having to step into more of a sales approach because I had to solve a problem. So the problem was that training as a service, I now have a number on my head. I have to produce results in that respect. So I actually started to look at, well, how do I generate more revenue? You know, we're a small team. We've got a limited number of training offerings that we have. And what I did was through investigation of understanding, okay, what can we do, is I found that there was a massive gap. So our sales teams were only selling one of the 7 products we have. I was like, oh, hang on, why aren't you selling the others? Did some further investigation and discovered that actually they didn't feel comfortable talking about those other products. They didn't feel they understood what they could bring to a customer. So I then took it upon myself to then actually start running mini workshops on all of those different products. And what was the value proposition? Why would people buy it? What would be the benefits to them? And that's how it kind of started in that sales enablement, if you like, space. But all the stuff I'd learned in L&D, I had brought to the table and combined it through, here's some skills, here's some knowledge, how do I wrap that information up while addressing a problem? And because of that, in that particular example, we went from 200% to 600% increase in revenue, happier customers, happier salespeople.
It's amazing that, you know, what you measure is what you improve. And almost this journey for you started with the fact that instead of an objective like courses complete or hours spent learning, the fact that now moving into training as a service, you were now given an objective, which was in effect a performance objective. That almost forced you to change your process from what you were doing, right? Like, so it really does kind of point to the fact that if you're given the right metric and the right incentive, then you're likely to change it. Now, I guess having gone down that journey, now when you look at L&D and just how L&D operates without this enablement piece, what really stands out to you as kind of the difference in approach?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting because I feel like I've kind of continued to evolve down that route of combining, I would say, the best of both worlds. And when I meet my fellow peers whether it's in enablement or in L&D, they're still quite separate. And an enablement person will default to producing content, just different types of content to perhaps an L&D person. And yes, they have numbers, but I think they miss the learning aspect of it. I think that's a component that's missing. Whereas when I look at L&D, I see the opposite. So yes, we've produced courses, to address a particular skill or something like that, but it's not married up to, well, has it made a difference? Has it been successful? And that, yeah, there's still some of those measurements of completions, for example, but a completion doesn't tell me anything. It's like, okay, so you've ticked a box, which might be fine in the early stages when you're trying to get maybe some adoption or building engagement, but long-term wise, you can't work like that, because how do you know where you're putting your effort is the right place? And I think that a lot of the time when I'm mentoring people, for example, in L&D specifically, a lot of them are asking for help around, well, how do I prove the value?
Right.
And it's all around, well, have you got data points? Are you engaged with certain people? How do you know what's keeping them up at night? And are you trying to help work with them to solve that? But these are questions that they don't naturally ask.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes, dare I say, that there's maybe a bit of a fear to step outside of that, because what happens if I'm not delivering so many courses?
So what one of the things that stood out for me there in when you changed your process and you were moving towards this kind of enablement, was the kind of, you were talking to people, you were talking to stakeholders, you were doing essentially problem discovery to really understand what's going on here, to kind of figure out that actually they're only selling one of the products out of the 7, right?
Yep.
Why do you think we don't do that in L&D, or why do you think you weren't doing that when you were just focused around learning and development and then you started doing it?
I think because it's set up in such a way that there seems to be this perception that we're measured on how many courses we've delivered, and then there's the other piece actually, is we feel like we have to say yes.
Right.
So people come and ask, oh, I've got this, I always use time management as the example. It's probably the worst one, the most dated one. But, I need someone in my team. They're not very good in running meetings or whatever. Okay, yes, we can do something for you. And we become like yes people because we feel like we naturally want to help, right? And that's also why I kind of moved into the whole learning space, because I actually love helping people. But technically what I'm doing is solving problems and challenges, whether it's at the individual, group or org level. So I've kind of changed the way I position it. But I feel like we kind of act in a yes mode because we want people, I don't know, to like us and to feel like wanted. Because if people are coming to us, then it must be a good thing, right? Not always. Not always. And I think that's where we kind of need to step out from behind the curtain a little bit. And actually we can do a lot more good and provide a lot more help to people if we actually just ask them, what is it? Like, let me understand this more so I can make sure whatever service I do provide or support I provide actually is going to help you.
Have you got any advice on how to go about doing that? Because quite often when I'm speaking to L&D professionals, there's a bit of a fear, right? If they've never had to, especially if they've come from a function that was mainly around, say, compliance or org-wide programs that they were pushing out, they've never really found themselves in a position where they have to interact with other business stakeholders. And they find themselves in a position where they don't necessarily have the relationship to be able to ask some of these questions and challenge them when they're giving that order of saying, can you get me X?
Yep.
What's your kind of advice for how to go about doing that? If I have no relationship right now with those stakeholders, what do I do?
So for me, it's the same thing I do when I join a business. So the first thing I do is I actually actively go to them and I say, can I grab half an hour of your time? And here's what I kind of wanted to go through. So firstly, setting the scene with them and expectations. And my scene setting with them is always like, I'm new to the business. And in some ways, you could argue that actually, if this is the first time you're stepping out from behind that curtain, even if you've been there for 10 years, technically what you're doing is new to the business,
Yeah.
right? So I actually ask them for that time. And then I say, right, the objectives are I'm trying to understand a little bit more about your part of the business and what are your key kind of goals for this year. What are you trying to achieve? Where do you feel there's the biggest gaps? And trying to understand, I guess, the lay of the land within their function. And then saying, okay, so if you were in my position, how do you think I can help? And let them talk about, because what it will do is when they share with you how they think you can help, A, it'll give you insight into their perception.
Right.
But B, it'll also start getting them actually opening up. And it becomes about them, not about you. And then from there, say, okay, this is what I've understood. Do the follow-up. The follow-up is so important. Summarize. Use your tools nowadays. Like I'm happily use my transcripts and stuff like that to summarize and do that follow-up communication and say, this is what I've understood. And sometimes that technique of playing it back to them helps to reinforce, yes, you've understood me. Or actually, this isn't quite right. And now I've started to open up that channel of communication. I then set up like fortnightly or weekly, depending on which department it is and who they are, a frequency, a cadence of us syncing. And I ask them, would you be open to us kind of doing that? So just doing that actively, kind of stepping forward, you'll be surprised how people will be willing to actually want to share. And also because you're coming from a position of, how can I help?
Yeah. Would you recommend this model of kind of owning learning and development and enablement?
Yeah. I actually don't think they're that different in terms of what are we trying to do? Well, we're both trying to drive performance, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's at an individual, again, or a team or for the business, but the business is made up of individuals, right? So in actual fact, the theory behind it to me is the same. In the same way, if I take L&D, a lot of the courses that are produced, they tend to have objectives, right? So how is that different to objectives for creating any kind of learning experience, an overall one, even if it's a long program or a short program? Well, those objectives, you have to understand what are we trying to achieve, right? But in order to understand what we're trying to achieve, I need to understand what's the issue.
Yeah.
So actually, it's almost like taking, if I was building a training course, and taking the concepts of that framework, but putting it on a slightly bigger scale in that, okay, these are the issues. And it could be a sequence of courses, maybe training's not the answer as well. It can also just be an article. It could also just be, let's set up some one-to-ones or do some coaching. There's so many options in our toolkit that we can use that hence why I kind of steer away from even the term training myself. And I go, okay, so how do we get someone from A to B?
Yeah, it really stands out because I remember coming into this space as an outsider almost a decade ago. You kind of question the things that maybe if you've always been in this space, you kind of just accept, right? Like they're just norms and assumptions that just carried on from year to year. But exactly what you said, it didn't, fundamentally, the holy grail here is you want to change behavior so someone is performing better and they can grow in their career, whether you're an L&D or whether you're an enablement. And really looking at that structure, the only thing I could really see was it was almost a separation of what this person needs to know. You almost expect the enablement person to know more about the business, so more about the products and services you're selling, more about the actual job of selling or customer interactions, etc. Versus, I guess, in a traditional setup, they were almost looking at that L&D function as the almost content factory or ticking compliance boxes, and hence the reason why it had two separate ones. But now we're seeing more and more, I had recently had Henry from Lucid Group on the show, and he was talking about, he'd really like to rebrand L&D to be more kind of performance and enablement. And I know there's a broader narrative shift around this that kind of aligns to this. One of the blockers I often see there is this kind of challenge to demonstrate that, right? Like in what you measure. And measurement has always been a challenge in the conversations that I have with L&D professionals. How have you navigated that? Like owning enablement as well, has that made it easier for you to get the data to demonstrate your value?
I would say yes and no. So it's interesting because I actually had a conversation recently with someone in L&D about this. They're like, well, we don't have access to that data. I was like, okay, well, why don't you have access? Like, what's stopping you? Oh, well, they don't really. I was like, have you asked them? And again, it's stepping from behind the curtain. It's okay to ask. Now, they might not have time at that particular moment, and that's okay. Or maybe they'll point you in another direction. That's still okay as well. I think having that exposure to, especially in particular if it's sales enablement, and just to clarify on that, it could be revenue enablement as well.
Yeah.
It could be customer success would fall into that potentially. So they are used to having data around them all the time. So it's sitting there, but there's nothing stopping other people having access to it. And you could argue maybe enablement have kind of kept it to themselves and maybe they need to be a bit more open. But I think it has helped, but I don't think it's a showstopper, as I would call it. Like, I think you have to go out there and ask. And again, if I give an example, so one of the things we're doing now is extracting the data from our soon to launch learning system, and that's actually going straight into a BI tool for the customer arm of our organization. So they technically aren't under the sales enablement, if you like, remit, but they're actually using that to then feed that information into their customer dashboards, etc., so they can have really informed conversations with their clients. So that's helping to drive those relationships. Now, some of us might not think from an L&D perspective, oh, that's not my remit. Well, it is, because actually that's learning data that you have, and that's how you can trade, right? So now I've now provided that information, which is going to help them, which means that actually in the future, I can then use some of the data they have access to complement that and hear some of those stories of success.
Yeah, it's just hearing it from you there. It is, sometimes we over-engineer the solution for this, but quite simply, it is speaking to the people who someone in your business has access to the data that you're trying to move, right? Like that metric you're trying to move, someone has access to it, speak to them so they can give you access to it too. And it really is about building that relationship.
Yep.
And this is where often, I'm sure you've heard this one, but I hear the objection sometimes, which is, well, just because the metric moved in the right direction, it doesn't mean what I did in L&D works. And it often takes me by surprise because we have this unrealistic expectation that L&D has to be the solo hero here. But the reality is no function is ever a solo hero. And really what the business is looking for is, are you contributing to this metric moving or not? Do you find these challenges when you're trying to piece together this narrative around the impact you've had?
Yeah, I think even if you were just looking at pure enablement, it's very easy in enablement to also just fall into the trap of, oh, we'll pull everyone together in a room and we'll present to them, I don't know, new messaging, right? This is how we're going to sell this now. So what? So we've done that and like what happens next? But that in itself requires a lot of people involved. And sometimes it can be quite challenging because yes, it can be hard to find the metric that represents enablement or the learning influence, because potentially you could do a fantastic experience, right? And it's got all the bells and whistles, it's got all the right ingredients in it to be successful. You even set up the follow-up, and we've now got, I don't know, scorecards for people doing pitches and stuff like that. We've given feedback, etc. But there's also other teams that are involved in influencing that. For example, the managers of those teams, if they're not following up on things and being that extension of that learning, it can fall apart, because who they're going to listen to, me or their manager? So that can be quite hard. But at the same time, if you can keep pushing it, you have to keep on at it until the behavior becomes normal. And sometimes it does feel like you're pushing a rock up a hill, but boy, is it worth it, because then suddenly they become that natural advocate for you. But you just have to keep at it. You have to be stubborn, dig your heels in and just keep going.
It's not often I hear someone in L&D say to me that one of the big opportunities where they had tangible impact on the business from a learning perspective was the sales kickoff, right?
Yep.
But I think that talks about the unique position you're in, owning both an enablement and kind of learning and development. Talk to me about how you use the opportunity of the sales kickoff to kind of really leverage learning to have that impact.
Yeah, so sales kickoffs are Stressful, but great fun. I love them. So, because I get to stretch my own personal skills as well, like organizing an event, like who would have thought? But again, I just see it as a learning and enablement on a bigger scale. And again, I have to have objectives. So the core thing around that is, well, what are we trying to set off for the year? Because that's what it is. It's a kickoff for the year and it sets the tone. It should have a strong theme. This is what we're driving towards, right, for the year. And therefore, coming up with something, you get to play, like you get to do amazing gamification of things. So, for example, we did the revenue games with the Olympics theme and stuff like that. I mean, these are like competitive people naturally, right? So, to be able to bring it to life for them, but keeping it focused on what are we trying to change. So, a couple of things. It could be, for example, if you've had a big change in the business, like org restructures, for example, that plays into it, right? Because suddenly people are coming with a different mindset. So this is an opportunity to energize those people and give them back that purpose and say, oh, actually, I can see something's happening here. I can see these changes have been for the good. But at the same time, also leveraging it as an opportunity to reinforce certain things. So, for example, at our recent kickoff, we just launched a sales process, big changes, right? Because generally salespeople don't like being restricted by process or admin and things like that. So how do we bring that to life so that they feel like actually I'm learning something and I actually see the benefits? So structuring our whole games around that and focusing in on certain areas like running a discovery meeting. Hey, we've got a customer, you're all in teams. Getting them to do it as teams as well versus being just individuals allows people to shine, but also to help each other as well and put them in their stretch zone a little bit because some of them were nervous. Oh my God, I have to do an elevator pitch. And I have to do it in front of our C-suite. I'm like, you do realize you do this every day, but hang on, when it's your colleagues, that's a different conversation. Yeah. But making sure, again, coming back to that theme and what we were trying to achieve, energizing people, getting people excited, but also giving them the focus for the year. And went really well. We got to not only start cementing that sales process and the terminology around it and facilitating that change, but also what it did was it also shone a light on where areas perhaps we're not so good at and we thought we were. I had someone actually come up to me during the SKO and turn around, great sales rep, really good, slightly overconfident, all that kind of stuff. You know, he knows what he's doing. And to turn around to me and say, do you know what, Penny, I was nervous about doing this and I actually thought I didn't have anything to learn. And that's what made me nervous. And he goes, I learned a lot. He goes, wow, I actually suddenly had a moment to pause out of my day job and actually reflect on myself and my abilities. And I learned from my peers as well. And because of that, we then followed it up with a sequence. Now we have something called the sales gym. So keeping that athletics kind of sports theme going that happens every week. And it's an opportunity for 1 hour for that sales org to get together. And we use it as a way of communicating change, but running enablement type sessions, whether it is new pricing models, whether it is, oh, actually, we're going to do a new methodology, for example, and using that space and it now becoming a normal thing. Like, you know, every Friday they know there's a slot.
You know, that story you just shared just highlights the importance of self-awareness in learning, right? Like, because if you don't have the self-awareness to realize that there are things you don't know and you need to learn, that's going to dictate whether you're curious to learn in the first place, your appetite, whether you're going to receive things. And it kind of makes me remember I had this great conversation with who used to lead learning and development at Investec, and they'd done this kind of doctorate on the kind of emotional, personal sides that affect our ability to learn, right? Like if there's emotional baggage that makes you respond to something in a certain way and you're not addressing that and you're just pushing content, then actually you're not taking the whole self into account on whether they're going to learn this or not. Do you find you have to think about things like that here where you've got people without the self-awareness, big egos, you know, some people who may be a bit insecure about themselves? It's quite a lot to take into account when you're trying to design learning, right?
It is, right? And I think sometimes we forget that a little bit, that we are actually in the business of people, right? And people buy from people. So whether it's our concepts, whether it's our products, our services, whatever that is, and we will always look for what's in it for me. And I know it's an old phrase now, the old whiffing factor, but nothing's changed in that respect. And I think that you always have to take that into consideration. So you're never going to please everybody 100%. However, you do have to be mindful of how you structure something to cater for people who might be withdrawn, people who might be the lone wolf, if you like. And then there'll be those people who'll be over enthusiastic, etc. And sometimes you have to put people in discomfort because suddenly there's an exposure of, rather than just being stuck in the way of, I do things the same way all the time, like I'm okay. And I think particularly in the sales or revenue side of the org, it's very easy to be like that. And I tell you what, it is so rewarding, and it goes back to why I ended up moving into learning space in the first place, because that's where I get my kicks, is those individual people that come away with an aha moment. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to use that person next time, right? And suddenly that's also comes back to what we raised earlier around building relationships. People buy from people, right? So why not get those small wins with those individuals and then use them to be advocates for you and to help speak. So for example, you don't have to be the person that delivers the training. You don't have to be the person that builds all the content. That's also how you fall into that trap, right? Instead, go for that social learning approach, leverage the subject matter experts. I always believe that our role is actually to be guardians of learning and to put the framework around it and to kind of culminate and curate all that knowledge to create that experience by leveraging different people, by leveraging technology, etc., to help bring that to life. I don't need to be the expert in that particular topic.
How do you support what you do with, I guess, the right kind of tech tools and systems? How do you go about thinking there, right? Do you know I need tools A, B, and C for whatever I'm going to do? Or is it more based on, okay, right now, this is the pain, so I think I need this? How do you go about thinking of what you need?
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So normally I have to check the landscape first, like what do we have? And normally there's some that are really obvious, right? So I do need to have a good learning system. I need something that's going to help facilitate and bring learning and content or particular content to the people in the place that they work. So that's the first one that I always have to have a must as part of my kind of ecosystem. And more I'm kind of leaning away from just calling it a learning ecosystem and more of like a learning and knowledge system, right, or ecosystem, because they all bring different things to it. I also want to make sure I have certain tech that allows for automation, because through automation, it means I'm not stuck behind the desk, right? Which comes back to getting out into the field, getting out to speak to people. I don't want that getting in the way of me being with people and actually understanding what's going on. And at the same time, those things also become barriers for the end user or the customer, if you like, that I'm serving. So I definitely always have to have a learning platform in there. The other one that's actually becoming more and more as part of my standard kind of remit, if you like, is a content management platform, because there's something about content maintenance and it gets messy. And again, if I want to make sure the right content is appearing in the places where people need it, then a content management platform really, really helps with that. And again, I can leverage it. So it doesn't have to be training. It could be a one-pager that gives someone a guidance or a walkthrough of something.
Yeah.
So, and I can pull the multiple things together. Also things like a content library. Again, I don't need to be the expert. Why not use experts that are out there that specialize in certain topics? And what it does is it also brings a bit of color, different voices, different cultures, if you like, in some instances. Sometimes I like to slip in a little Aussie accent in there to throw the Americans off a little bit, things like that. But using those kinds of tools and building that ecosystem so that regardless of where someone is, they're going to find what they need, because I want them coming back.
Yeah. And the content management piece really stood out for me, because one of the most fascinating metrics for me on the HowNow platform, when we track these trends, is we have this thing called content verification, where essentially internal subject matter experts can verify whether the content is still up to date and relevant. And when we track the trends, we almost always find that the higher the percentage of content that's been verified as accurate and relevant, the higher the engagement that they see on that platform.
That's right.
And really, when you dig in deep, it's unsurprising, right? Like if you're giving them a clear indication that this is reliable and up to date, so and so has verified this, then I know I can trust it. But if you've got a system that's kind of full of stuff that I'm sitting there going, well, actually, this seems a bit out of date and not relevant anymore, that's a surefire way. And, people are busy. And the reality is, if they come once, maybe twice, and they're seeing things that are irrelevant and inaccurate, you've lost them. And
That's right.
It's hard enough to get people to come in once, but to get them to come once they've kind of made their first impression is a really tricky one.
Yep. And also what you'll find is it'll actually end up driving siloed behavior. So what will happen is they might download that asset, keep it on their desktop. Don't worry, I'll just take care of it myself and I'll make my own version.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then you have no visibility of that either. You don't know, oh, was that working? Like, can that help other people? Can I use that?
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree. And I think also if you're trying to set up and encourage more of a social learning aspect, and the fact that people want to feel valued, right, in whatever they're doing. And I think that a great way to do that is to leverage them as subject matter experts and have them as verifying content and validating things for you, and speaking in the videos or whatever it is that you're creating. Because again, your peers are more likely to listen to each other, and that helps solidify that. But also it empowers the people in the business that actually I can own and be a contributor to learning, and for us being better and performing better as well.
I mean, there's been incredible nuggets all throughout this, but I know you're very generous with giving up your time and mentoring people in this space, although you don't talk about it as much, I can tell. And I've heard from people who have been your mentees. It's been super helpful and added a lot of value. So let's kind of ask you the kind of final note for us and end on. What's that one thing you think, if people are just starting out in L&D, or maybe I've been in the space for a few years and I just want to refresh things, what's that one thing I should start doing from today?
Go out and say hello. It's as simple as that. Introduce yourself. Even if you've been there for years, I guarantee there's a bunch of people that don't know you, and maybe they don't quite understand what you do, or they just have this perception. My biggest thing is get out there, introduce yourself to an enablement team if you have one, start building that relationship, and then just start in one area of the business. It doesn't have to be everywhere. Just start somewhere where you think, actually, I think that could be quite a good turnaround. Like, I can just make an impact here. Then I've got my example or use case that I can then use and tell the story with to other departments. But get out there, set up a meeting, get to know them, get to know what their challenges are, and then go away and do that follow-up piece, as I kind of mentioned earlier. I think we've got to I keep saying step from behind the curtain, but we do. We need to step out of the shadows and actually be in there, because we've got a lot to offer, a lot. And nowadays we can't afford the risk anymore of not learning and not constantly wanting to evolve and be better, because the world is moving quickly. And what a great way to be able to support that.
What a note to finish on. I feel like I need to close this episode off with like Adele, hello from the other side. But it's been an absolute pleasure, Penny. Thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been great.
This episode of L&D Disrupt is brought to you by HowNow, the learning platform that actually makes learning matter. Because let's face it, you could push out loads of content, track skills in a spreadsheet, drown in admin, and still not know what's working. Or you could use HowNow to connect your people to the skills they need. Deliver learning in the flow of work and prove it's making a difference. That's how modern companies like Depop, Trainline, Crunchyroll, SoEnergy, TomTom, Investec, and so many more do it. Learn more at gethownow.com.